All right, and welcome to our third and final PowerPoint of the week and the end of World War II. Today we're going to be talking about the storming of Normandy, the end of Hitler and Mussolini, and kind of the immediate aftermath of World War II. So let's get into it. As we go through this lesson, I'd like to ask you guys to keep in mind, would you call World War II a success for the Allies or not? Why or why not? And are there different kinds of successes? Keep that in mind. All right, so first up, Europe in Chaos. Operation Overlord, also known as D-Day, on June 6, 1944, was an amphibious/airborne assault on the beaches of Normandy. And by amphibious, I mean it was basically they got in on barges and kind of started barging onto the beaches. This was the start of the Allied invasion of France. There's a lot of interesting stuff with the storming of Normandy with D-Day, including Agent Garbo, which if you watched the kind of optional video yesterday, or with the last PowerPoint, you would have seen a little bit about that, but also with the Ghost Army. The Ghost Army, which I believe is an optional video that I have attached to today's PowerPoint. So if you're interested in learning about the U.S. Ghost Army, make sure to check that out. On August 25th of 1944, you get the liberation of Paris, and 5 days later you have Allied control of northern France. Between all this, you have the deaths of 225,000 Allied troops and 300 to 500,000 Axis troops, which was a very, very steep cost. If you would like to see a kind of dramatic, theatrical depiction of the storming of Normandy, if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, the beginning scene is basically just that. In December of 1944, you get what's called the Battle of the Bulge, in which Allied forces defeat a final offensive move of the Germans. Kind of the last strike of the Germans is defeated. And in March of 1945, the Allies cross the Rhine into Germany and start moving towards Berlin. The Rhine is a river that kind of separates Germany from France, and the Allies cross that river into Germany and start moving towards Berlin, where Hitler was stationed. If they can get to Berlin and take out the capital, well, the war is over. This is one of the kind of pictures coming out of D-Day. This picture is a little bit warped. You can see right there, his arm is kind of moved forward, but you can see more modern kind of army uniforms. You can see them taking down the Nazi flag, destroying it, all sorts of good stuff. You have the Battle of the Bulge. Again, they would fight both in the winter and any other time in the year, and in Northern Europe it gets pretty chilly. And you have, again, the movement. You have this kind of built bridge because the Germans had destroyed the actual bridge crossing the Rhine to stop Allied forces, but did it really? No. And you can see that the 85th Engineers built a bridge to cross the Rhine so that Allied troops could get into Germany. You have paratroopers landing into kind of enemy territory. And paratroopers were a unique thing for World War II. You had troops constantly parachuting down, and it was seen as war crime or as uncouth to shoot a parachute because it was just such an easy target. It was, you really didn't do it because if you had to eject and were parachuting, you didn't want someone to shoot you, so why would you shoot someone else in a parachute? Again, just pictures from the occupation of France, all this sort of stuff, going into Maastricht, which is in the Netherlands. And lastly, this picture, in which we discussed this a little bit in class, but after the Germans were pushed out of France, pushed out of Germany, a period of shaming came about, in which women who associated with, or people who associated with Nazis, were punished. Women especially were targeted and had their heads shaved, would often be marked with a swastika to show that they had helped the Nazis at some point or affiliated with the Nazis if you were dating a Nazi, anything like that. And they had vegetables thrown at them, rotten food. It was a huge shaming for these women after the war. VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, the UK and US forces are approaching Berlin from the west and the Soviets approaching from the east. In April of 1945, and April is a big month for World War II. On April 12th, FDR died, sadly, and Truman took over the presidency. On April 15th, the Soviets reached Berlin before the Allied forces did. On April 28th, Mussolini was captured and executed. He was brutally beaten and hung at a gas station for everyone to see. And 2 days later, surrounded by enemies and hearing about how Mussolini's people captured and executed him, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in their bunker. Now, this is a picture of Mussolini being hung. Again, people surrounded him. People threw things at the bodies. People were very happy when he died. And this is Hitler and Eva Braun. And Hitler and Eva Braun were not the only ones to commit suicide. A lot of Nazi officials committed suicide as Allied forces moved in. One in particular, I can't remember which one, actually gave his children cyanide while they slept, killing them as well as killing himself and his wife, just so they would not have to face the justice of the Allied troops. And we'll talk a little bit more about why they were so scared about justice and of justice next week when we talk about the Holocaust. In May of 1945, you have on the 4th, German soldiers in Germany, Holland, and Denmark surrendering. On the 7th, 3 days later, you have all of Germany surrendering, and the next day is marked as VE Day, or Victory in Europe. So you have huge celebrations of people basically celebrating German ends. But was the war over? No. We were still fighting someone else, and the war would not be over until everyone that we were fighting against surrendered. But before we get into that, you have the Potsdam Conference. And the Potsdam Conference was agreements on post-war German economy that said no more industry, no more factories. You were going to be an agricultural industry, and war criminals were going to be charged. Truman, during this time, also received word of the first successful atomic bomb test, and he would go on to mention it to Winston Churchill, but not so much Stalin. Believe it or not, people were not so trustful of Stalin, especially when it came to weapons of mass destruction. In the Pacific Theater, which remember is about Japan, in July of 1944, you get the 4-year Battle of Burma, seen as a victory for the British. The Japanese reinvade, though, and the conflict lasts another couple months until 1945. In November of 1944, you get the introduction of kamikazes, or divine wind. Kamikazes were named after a typhoon that stopped the Mongolians from invading Japan, and they were suicide bomber pilots. And throughout the course of World War II, you had about 2,500 of them. February to March of 1945, you get the Battle for Iwo Jima, in which the Japanese Imperial Army, 21,000 against the United States Marine Corps, about 70,000. At the end of the war, you have 20,000 casualties for the Japanese Imperial Army and only 7,000 of the Marines. Now, the Japanese refused to surrender, though, and you actually had 2 soldiers lasting until 1949. The Battle of Iwo Jima was ultimately unstrategic, and it was not a very good win for the Allies, but it was really significant for morale because it was seen as the final push against Japan. These are some of the, well, this is a picture of one of the ace pilots for Japan. The ace pilots at this time were kind of seen as rock stars in Japan. It's really interesting to go back and read some of the stories that were written about these guys. And with the Potsdam Conference, again, coming up again, must be important. The Potsdam Conference required Japan to surrender or face prompt and utter destruction, and Japan refused. Now that prompt and utter destruction would be seen as the atomic bombs, would be seen as Truman deciding to drop the atomic bombs on August 6, 1945 on Hiroshima, giving Japan another chance to surrender, Japan refusing to, and on August 9th, bombing Nagasaki. 5 days later, Japan surrendered, and on September 2nd, MacArthur accepted Japan's surrender, and we call that VJ Day, or Victory in Japan. And this is MacArthur, and this is Emperor Hirohito. This is a really interesting picture, and it rubbed a lot of Japanese individuals the wrong way because Emperor Hirohito is dressed very formally, whereas MacArthur is dressed as he would be. It showed to a lot of high-ranking Japanese officials as a lack of respect. It showed a lot of Japanese officials that the U.S. didn't really respect Hirohito or Japanese customs, but to the U.S. it showed that, MacArthur's so much taller than Hirohito. It showed a lack of kind of animosity. Now, the atomic bombs, which we'll talk a little bit more about next week, were devastating for Nagasaki and Hiroshima. You had things like radiation burn. You had the ultimate destruction of towns and cities. Curiously enough, this Torii Gate did stand, but you have absolute destruction, and this was a widespread thing because people who survived the bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima didn't just stay where they were. They moved throughout Japan and told people the stories of what was going on. This was a major event in their history, and it was a very dark time. People were sick, people were dying, but in the US, you have celebration. You have this great kind of celebration around the world, besides in Japan, of these bombs. And we'll talk a little bit more about the bombs and more about kind of the actual construction of them a little bit right now. In 1939, Germany learned how to split an atom. Albert Einstein and this other scientist named Enrico Fermi reached out to FDR, basically saying, look, Germany is understanding how to split an atom. This could be very dangerous for the world. In 1941, you have the Manhattan Project being born. And the Manhattan Project is a code name for the creation and building of the atomic bomb by the United States. In 1942, you get the first nuclear chain reaction, and then you have it being moved to New Mexico under the leadership of a guy named Robert Oppenheimer. And these individuals working on the Manhattan Project were sworn to secrecy. Nobody knew what they were doing. July 16th, 1945, you have Trinity being the first successful test of the nuclear bomb. You have a half-mile wide crater, a mushroom cloud that reached 40,000 foot, and the light from the bomb was visible 200 miles away. Less than 3 weeks later, Fat Man and Little Boy were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is Albert Einstein, if you've never seen a picture of him before, which I'm sure all of you have, but just to give you a little reminder of who he was. And then this is Robert Oppenheimer. When the bombs were dropped, there were signatures. The guys dropping them, the flight crew, wrote and signed them because it was a historic moment. You have this guy from Wisconsin. You have Here's to You from Chicago. You have all these different things going on. Now, the atomic bomb was based off of Einstein's theories and Oppenheimer's coordination. But between the two of them, they were really the brains behind the atomic bombs. And this is a little explanation of how they work. But this is Fat Man and this is Little Boy. They're named because of how they look. Fat Man was the first to be created, and Little Boy was a little bit more technologically advanced. Now, immediately after the war, you have the Nuremberg trials. And the Nuremberg trials were 13 international trials lasting 4 years prosecuting Nazi war criminals. Some of these criminals were executed, some were imprisoned. Germany was split into 4 zones, with France in the southwest, the United Kingdom in the northwest, the United States in the south, and the Soviet Union controlling the east. Between the west and the east, you have a separation of West and East Berlin, where the capital was split West and East, West being capitalist, East being communist. The US and Soviet Union are the only remaining world superpowers, and this is really important. Every other country in Europe had been attacked. Japan was majorly hit by the atomic bombs and had economic sanctions placed on it after the war. Britain had been bombed constantly by the Germans. France was under the control of the Germans for a very long time. Russia, the Soviet Union, and the United States were the untouched powers in the world, and so they were able to rise to the forefront of everybody's minds. Next up, you have the Geneva Conventions in 1949, which furthered protections for wartime, which protect non-combatant civilians, protect wounded or shipwrecked sailors at sea, and protection of POWs, prisoners of war. The UN was created as peacekeepers. Representatives from each country came together to kind of meet, talk about issues instead of going to war, and the total casualties for World War II lie somewhere between 70 million to 85 million. This is a map of the split of Germany. You can see, again, the kind of Russian zone, the British zone, American zone, and French zone. Curiously enough, Berlin, the capital, is very far out. but you have East and West Berlin, and eventually East and West Germany, kind of based off of these lines, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get into the Cold War. Now, after we finish World War II, and granted we didn't go into as much detail as I would have liked because of time constraints and because of this new kind of e-learning system that we have, I want you guys to think, what lasting effects were there of World War II? And do you believe that this kind of war will ever happen again? We almost had that in January with World War III, but do you guys think that it will happen? And again, I know it says story time, and I can tell you guys a little bit about Mad Jack Churchill or the Mad Piper Bill Millen. If you guys want to, I will kind of give you guys a quick synopsis of them. Mad Jack Churchill was a soldier who is the only soldier in World War II to have a confirmed kill with a bow and arrow, and as you can see in this picture, he also fought with a long sword in World War II. The Mad Piper, however, was a soldier who played the bagpipes during the operation at Normandy and walked up and down the beaches, was never shot, but just played the bagpipes throughout the entire storming and throughout the entire invasion. Both men are pretty interesting. I find them interesting. If you'd like to know more, maybe I'll open up a discussion post and we can chat about them, or feel free to look them up on your own. But that about sums it up for today. And again, we aren't going as in depth or as detailed as I would like about World War II, but hopefully you guys kind of understand the general order of how things happened. But again, if you have any questions, any concerns, please feel free to reach out. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Don't forget to take the quiz on EDSB, but I hope you have a good rest of your day and keep working hard.